Hello and welcome back to Mambel Technology Group. In this video, we're going to see how to create a virtual switch. We will create an internal switch and we will add our different VMs to the domain. It means what we're trying to do in this series, we are trying to create a virtual switch, and the switch is going to allow internal connections among these VMs that belongs to the mtg.com domain. So before we can do that, we need to create an internal switch and make sure that our VMs are pointing to be talking through that internal switch, because you can have your VMs talking to the external switch or any other switch. But I need us to create our own custom switch. And what we're going to do, once it's created, we will point the internet of this VM to be talking through that, not the internet actually, but the connection, the network connection amongst these VMs will be through the internal switch. So let's go ahead on the Hyper-V Manager to set that up. So right here, we are on our Hyper-V Manager, and each virtual machine here needs to be connected through a switch. Now here we have the virtual switch. Is on the virtual switch that we have to configure our switch. So if you click on this, you have three types of switch here, right? You have the external switch. You can use this one when you want your VM to be exposed to the internet or to accept external connections. Internal switch, which is what we're going to definitely use here, is actually creating our own private network in such a way that our VMs can be talking, can be communicating to each other within that network. And then you also have a private switch. So let's create an internal switch. Highlight it and then click on create a virtual switch. We're going to give it a name. Let's call this one my switch. You can give it any name here. You can give it any name, or I can just call it, let me give it a name of the domain, or just call this one mtd. So that's going to be the name of our internal switch, and then click on apply to apply the changes. Once it's applied, you can see here it says internal only. It means that it can only work within your internal network, and click on OK. So at this point, we just created an internal switch, but none of these VMs are pointing to that switch at this time. So the first thing we want to do, highlight the domain controller or the DC, right click and go to settings. And once we are in the settings, you can see the network adapter right now is saying default. With this default, you cannot do anything because you have not created your own custom internal network. So instead of default, we're not going to use the default. We will use the MTG, which is going to be our switch. This is what we want to use. So you can either do it this way, or you can go on firmware and say network adapter, add one, and then drop down and select MTG, which is our network adapter. Apply this change, and you can see it here. So it's just like we added it twice. So let me click on OK, go back there, and go on settings. You see at this point we have two switch because I already added the first time. So you can actually remove one of these switch, remove this one, fine, say yes, and say okay. At this point, we have our virtual switch ready, and you can see our DC is talking on this switch. So every other VM that we have to add within this network has to be connected to the internal switch, to that internal switch. If not, the VMs will not be able to communicate with each other. Now, let's look at one of the VM if it's up and running. Right. This is node 1. You can see here node 1. Let's actually do the configurations on node 1. Node 1, remember in our first video, that is where we installed and created node 1. Right now, everything is still on default, and the same changes we made when we were creating our domain controller, the DC, we have to apply the same changes here. So the first thing is to turn off the firewalls, turn off everything so that our internal network can easily work fluidly without any problem, so that our private network can communicate and the computers within our private network should be able to communicate with each other. So you have to turn off all this. And the next thing is to assign the IP address. Node 1 here, let's look at our topology and see what IP address node 1 is using. So node 1 is using .4 IP address. Okay, and remember, for node 1 to be able to communicate with the DC or the domain controller, since we have our domain here with the DNS, we will use this domain controller's IP address as the default DNS for these two VMs, so that these two VMs will be able to communicate with the DC where the domain is sitting. So the default DNS here has to be the IP address of this DC. I hope you get that. Okay. Now, here we are. The next thing we want to do here is to, let me refresh this and make sure that the firewalls are turned off. The next thing we want to enable remote desktop to all remote connections. Say, okay. All right. At this point, we have to rename this. If we don't rename this and we just add this to the domain here, is going to pick this name, which is not the right thing. By the time we're doing other things in a series of our videos and we want to provide a fully qualified domain name for this VM, it's not going to see node 1 if we don't change the name right now. So let's click here and click on change the name to node 1. And as usual, it is going to prompt us to restart our PC. Click on OK, click on close. And before we restart this, let's also change the IP address to properties and disable the IPv6 because we don't need it. And then let's go to IPv4. We're not going to use the automatic or the dynamic IP address. We're going to provide a static IP address as seen on the diagram. 192.168.100. 192.168.100.4. The subnet mask is going to be the same. The default gateway is going to be the same, 168.100.2. And this is where you prefer DNS. The preferred DNS is going to be the IP address of the DC, the domain controller. 92.168.100.3. This point, we are good. So we will go ahead and restart this PC so that it can apply all those changes before we can join it to the domain. So as you can see on the screen, our PC is fully back restarted. And you can see now everything here, the IP address is just as exactly as we gave it. And you can see the computer name now changed from the funny name to node 1. So now we have to join this computer to the domain. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we also change its network, its Ethernet or its network interface into the internal network that we created, which was MTG. So to do this, let's go back on the Hyper-V Manager and we are on node 1, right click and go to settings. And for the switch here, it's still going to be default. Change it to MTG and apply this. This is our internal network. At this point, we can go ahead and change the workgroup and add this to the domain. Click on this and say change. Here, we want to add this to the domain. So this node 1 has to be a member of the domain, not workgroup. So click on domain and provide the domain here. The domain is mtg.com. Click on OK. If everything is good, if the firewall is good and everything, is going to pick up the domain and it will prompt us to provide a password because the domain is in the Active Directory. But if there is a problem and it can communicate like right now, then definitely something is wrong and we need to figure out what is wrong and resolve it really quick. So at this point, we have to configure or add this node 1 to the domain mtg.com. Initially, we had a slight problem, but it is because the IP address of the domain controller for some reason had changed and went back to automatic. So I just resolved it and provided a static IP address. So I'll just click on the workgroup, change, and add it to the mtg domain. So this node 1 has to be a member of this mtg.com and click on OK. It's going to prompt you for the username of the domain controller where the domain is configured and the password. So you need to know that. So this one is going to be administrator and its password. Click on OK. And it says welcome to mtg.com. So, and at the end of the day, you will need a restart. So you see, we successfully added this virtual machine to mtg.com domain. So let's actually restart it and see how it works. So at this point, our restart is complete and I just logged in. Let's actually verify now what are some of the changes. If it has been successfully added to the domain, we should see mtg.com right here. You can see it is added to the mtg.com domain, which sits right here on DC domain controller mtg.com. And to confirm that these two actually sit within the same network and they can communicate to each other, I will initiate a ping from either side. So go here and type CMD for your command line interface. Click enter and say ping DC. So what is happening behind the scene? You are pinging the domain controller, and this is the name of the domain controller, DC. So this name is going to resolve to the IP address at the level of the DNS, and it's going to return a message if it can reach it or not. So enter, and you can see the test is going through here, and it gives you the statistics, right? Pinging the statistics for that is the IP address of my domain controller. If I should go back here, this is my domain controller, and you can see the IP address here is 100.3. So it pinged 100.3 successfully. Now let's do it the other way around. Let's try to ping node 1 from DC here. So CMD and then say ping node 1. You can provide the IP address or you can provide the name, and you can see the ping is going through, so both can communicate at this point. And at this point, we learned in this lesson how to create a virtual switch, and that virtual switch serves as our internal network or our private network. And after creating the virtual switch, we added these node 1 to the domain, and the domain is mtg.com. And at this point, both can communicate very well. And this is how to set up uh, a domain controller, create a domain, and then add servers to that particular network or to join the domain. Node 1 successfully joined the domain. And this is where we're going to stop today. In our next video, we are going to add node 2 to the domain, and then we are going to create a Windows Server failover cluster. We will create a Windows Server failover cluster. Actually, it's not a cluster instance. So at this point, we'll create a Windows Server failover cluster, and it's not an instance. So this is not supposed to be an instance. It's supposed to be Windows Server failover cluster. So you can see the topology. We created a domain controller, and we installed the DNS, the DNS feature, and we created our domain, which is mtg.com. Later, we created a network switch, a virtual network switch, which is our internal private network, and we added node 1 to this domain, and we can see that both of them can communicate very well. In our next video, we will add node 2 to the domain, and once that is done, we will create our Windows Server failover cluster. And the reason for creating this Windows Server failover cluster is because we want to, in the subsequent videos, I will show you how to create always on availability group, which is a high availability solution. And one of the prerequisites to be able to create always on or deploy always on is to have a Windows Server failover cluster in place already. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.